to our show sponsors, Acadian Plant Health, Corteva Enlist E3, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry and fail to understand your needs, ADAMA is here to deliver, and we're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith. And Peter, I'm going to say that 2 minutes late is on time for this show. So there you go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Ray out in Calgary. Jason's in Southern Manitoba. Already joined the chat. And of course, Peter Johnson here in Southern Ontario is here. So going to have a really great chat tonight. I'm pretty excited. We've got some great slides to share, some great guests, some great clips. Super excited. Of course, as always, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow. Let us know you took in the show and we'll get those for you. And just a quick reminder, next week there is no show. So most of the Real Ag team is actually going to be in Germany at Agritechnica. And so we are not going to have a show next Monday, but we'll be back after that talking about what makes good data and making decisions from good data. So super excited for that. But let's get to tonight's show. Tonight, we're going to talk about variety and hybrid selection. We're focused here on canola and soybeans. We're going to talk about considerations for those early season pests and, of course, your weed spectrum. And to have that conversation, let's bring in our guests. We have two newbies for the show. I won't pretend that you're newbies to this discussion. But there you go. Chris Manchur, the Canola Council of Canada, based out of Winnipeg, and Sheila Murphy with Corteva here in Ontario as well with me. Chris, welcome to the show.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here, Lindsay.
Yeah, all right. And Sheila, thank you for saying yes.
Well, thanks for having me.
I should warn everyone that I gave Sheila quite the scare when today she thought for a moment that I expected her to talk about canola. But don't worry, everyone. Chris is going to talk about canola. Sheila's going to talk about soybeans. And everything's going to be fine. Okay. But as it is your first time here, Chris, I'll start with you. Let everybody know a little bit about you. What do you do at the Canola Council of Canada?
Yeah, so with the Canola Council, I'm an agronomy specialist located here in the eastern Manitoba half. And I kind of play quite a few different roles here, including, like, say, research and admin, and as well as being the lead for the Sclerotinia stem rot. And then in my spare time, I also go and hang around our territory, helping growers and agronomists kind of make some really good decisions, just like choosing what treatments and traits we want to see on our canola.
I see what you did there. Just pulled it all in. I like it. All right. And Sheila, tell us about what keeps you busy in a day.
Lots keeps me busy. I'm the seed products agronomist for Eastern Canada. So I cover the seed portfolio for Corteva, all our brands. Corn, soybeans, winter wheat. And I like to think of my role as being the link between what's coming out of seed product development and our boots on the ground sales team. So keeping them excited and informed about products that we have coming through the pipeline.
All right. Okay. So there you are. Everyone who's, of course, joining us here, watching online, watching us live, get those questions in, observations, curiosities, all those sorts of things, get them in early. We'll try and get them covered here in the course of this hour. Okay, so let's start with, Chris, maybe I'll start with you. We do, of course, when we're talking about hybrid selection, of course it's yield, right? Of course it's yield. What would you say, though, comes second or third after that when you have these discussions on what farmers are perhaps most interested in when trying to make this decision?
Yeah, so when you're talking about seed selection and such, you almost don't want to talk about yield being like what you're looking for in a variety. You want to see the things that actually contribute to that final yield. And usually that's about protecting yourself from a lot of yield robbers that we see. Across the prairies, we see any variety of pests as well as diseases that could be infecting early on. So say when we're going to be going and, advising what kind of varieties we want to choose, it really has to be happening on a local kind of perspective, and both realizing that there's a lot of different kinds of combinations of different traits, things that you can put on your seed. And that all has to kind of come into factor in terms of what's going to work on your field. And likely there's actually going to be a couple different varieties that are going to work, different combinations. And you want to be sure that you're going to be trying kind of a mixture of some.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sheila, when we think about, making these decisions on ordering our varieties for the year, um, I mean, there's a lot that goes into. It's not just the variety. We have to think about the seed treatment package. We have to think about sort of all of these things pretty early, right? I mean, we're making these decisions now for next year. So how do you sort of make that decision tree from one to the other on how you're going to narrow it down what's most important for your farm?
Right. Yeah, you need to have a long look backwards, right? We don't want to farm just what happened this year, right? We want to think about your history on your fields over the past bit of time. Where have you been successful? Where have you had challenges? And then work with your agronomy team to help figure out what products might have the best chance of success going forward, knowing full well that we can't predict the future. So the first piece of advice I give people is, and maybe producer Jay, if you want to pull up the Pioneer Seed Guide image, this is a document that we're really proud of at Corteva, and it's our seed guide. And I know it's teeny tiny there, you can't see everything, but we're really open, honest, and transparent as Chris was talking about various traits that you need to think about, pests and so forth. These are our product scores, and these scores will help you narrow down what may or may not fit on your farm, right? What is your history of white mold? And so you want to go for a higher white mold score. And like I said, these are given to us from our research team. Their scores are developed with both genetic information as well as our in-field testing. So this is a really good place to start, narrow down your maturity, figure out what your major pests are, and key in on a product there.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm so glad you brought up the recency bias. Chris, how tough is it at times to sort of, yes, we have to think about, what was the biggest challenge this year, but ultimately, as Sheila says, we can't predict the future. So how do we try to sort of shake off that I just dealt with this, so that's what I'm going to be hyper focused on next?
Yeah, exactly right. When we're thinking about, cultivar selection and such across, the prairies, the canola rotation, averages, say even between 1 and 2, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, maybe. So you may not be returning to that field with canola in the past recent years. So when you're looking at the past performance of your hybrids on one particular field, they may not translate to the next field when you're growing it in the future years. So it's definitely good to kind of try and shake that kind of bias of high performing hybrids overall in your field. Of course, you want to try and choose something that's going to work great, but you really have to kind of get into that nuance of like, okay, kind of dig down a little deeper and figure out, well, especially in the case of, say, flea beetles or cutworms, if you choose a seed treatment that works really great against flea beetles, you may be opening the door for some cutworms to actually mow over your crop. So
Mm-hmm.
diversifying your risk in terms of that kind of perspective can be good.
Mm-hmm. Jason makes a point here. You're already late, to be honest. Do we mean yes? Okay, I thought this is what he meant, but I want to clarify this, and perhaps I'll put it to you, Sheila. Just how early? It feels like this selection season gets earlier and earlier every year. When do you see sort of the biggest push for those final decisions in variety choice?
Yeah, it seems to get earlier every year, and especially in Eastern Canada, where we have had a very late harvest.
Mm-hmm.
It seems earlier. Um, but most businesses, most companies, there's some early discounts to capitalize on, and so that's why we go early. And I mean, it's not just because we like to do that. It's because the seed business is a very complex business. We don't have an Amazon warehouse where I can order something and have it show up to my door the next day, right? So a lot of behind the scenes work is done to make sure that when you order early, we can try to get you the products that you've ordered on time and in time for planting the next season.
and then we have a challenging spring, and then everybody wants to switch it. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, but that also happens. But I mean, to
It
that
sure
point,
does.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, you're right. We've had a very challenging and late harvest here in Ontario. Anecdotally, at least, how does that impact that decision? Is it that farmers delay it because they're just too busy, or when they're not in the field, are they bugging their agronomists? How does a late harvest really impact this decision, you think?
Well, I think for those people that are waiting for yield data before they're going to make a seed choice,
Mhm.
it might impact those people a little bit more. But as Chris also mentioned, it's more than yield. Yes, yield is the top three traits that our breeding program goes after. But I think it'd be worthwhile to spend some time with your agronomist through the entire season. Walk your fields as things are coming up. Did your seed treatments work like you thought they would?
Yeah.
What other early season challenges did you have? What sort of decisions could you have made? So that if you know the answers to those things, you're prepared going into harvest for thinking about something that you might want to see in your variety selection for next year.
Now, both Jason and Peter have sort of hit on one of these things that, especially, these decisions are often pushed for early when we don't necessarily have the most recent data, maybe for some of the newer lines or those sorts of things. This is what we're going to dig into maybe next episode a little bit more, is in digging into some of this data. But I think generally speaking, um, Chris, do you find that being a challenge, that farmers are not sure necessarily until they really crunch the numbers, or do we love our favorites and we keep going back to them anyway?
I think it can be a mix of both, but I think what farmers really want is that kind of assurance that, whatever they choose is going to work well for their farm. And really, the only way to get there is with lots of data. And now I'm not saying looking at a variety and taking a look at their map and saying it's yielded very well 2 provinces over. There's many different ways you can pull data from. You can talk to your neighbor and ask about how that's been going, talk to your agronomist, what they've been seeing on their performance trials on their local tests, or take a look at more of those regional bases, and then also online information, like say like Canola Council of Canada website, where we have a lot of side-by-side comparisons, and including say the canola performance trials, which does have some fairly recent data. So in terms of collecting the full story, it's about taking a look at all this information from different areas to kind of influence your decisions, not just choosing what you've known, what's worked on your farm, because you may be missing out on something really great.
Mm-hmm. All right,
I
let's.
might
Oh, go ahead.
Can I
Yeah,
add
go ahead,
one more
Sheila.
comment?
Of
So
course.
as we develop seed products, our job as breeders and scientists is to prevent surprises. So even if you don't have this year's data, your seed seller, your agronomist will have data from the organization that we call them predictions. And it's how we advance new products, and it's how we predict performance. So, and it's long-term data. It's a really good piece of information to use,
Mm-hmm.
even if
So
you don't have the neighbor's
yeah.
trial next door yet.
Yeah, done yet. So Jim actually sort of sends a shout out to some great seed dealers, that working with your local seed dealer might have that data of a different variety or hybrid, and maybe some background information that not the general public's privy to, that they might be able to draw on. So yeah, for sure. And so let's shift the focus a little bit, Sheila, thinking about um, early season, as far as choosing that seed treatment package. And Chris, I'll ask you the same thing, but Sheila, for what shifts have you seen in what growers are selecting? Let's stay focused on soybeans, but we can touch on corn as well. But what have you seen as far as that shift in seed treatment options?
I think we've seen a shift to people selecting a seed treatment and for their peace of mind. It's not something that you ever want to be faced with, where you didn't put a seed treatment on and the spring was cold and wet, and you regret your decision. Most of the time, the seed treatment is your silent friend. it was there, it was insurance, and we drive on through the season, and you don't have a performance call over it. And maybe, Jay, if you want to pull up my soybean pot, we've got a Seed Applied Technology Center for Seed Applied Technology in Woodstock, Ontario, and our scientists there, because we've had this conversation in the field. It's like, well, how do I know my seed treatment's working? And most of the time, it just does. Not that slide. You should see little
they're
soybean
pots, Jay. Yeah, I think it's near the end, I want to say.
There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
There. So you can scroll through these, but the first couple slides were seed treatment, early germination differences, and in these pots there was no inoculum, so there's no pest in the soil. But you can already see that the seed applied seed was already popping out of the pot, and this is just in the seed lab. It's 19 degrees, well watered, and so on. And if you keep scrolling, Jay, you'll see later. Those are the same pots, and there was significantly more growth in the treated pot. And then as you keep going, we inoculated some with the Fusarium species and some with Phytophthora, just to show the effect of seed treatments are valuable insurance, and you don't want to end up unprepared for what the spring might send you.
So just quickly, Sheila, if these weren't inoculated, what did you attribute the differences in the seed treatment, in the differences in growth?
Yeah, seed treatments will give you some early seedling vigor, and I think that's what we're seeing here, even in the uninoculated pots. It's just helping the beans germinate and emerge faster than an untreated check.
It's like a shot of espresso.
Yeah.
Get it rolling. Yeah, there you go. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Chris, I feel like, though, when we talk about seed treatments in canola, I mean, yes, we think diseases for sure, but really we are very concerned about flea beetles. We're very concerned about cutworm pressure. This year across the prairies, it certainly seemed like cutworms became more of an issue in a lot of areas than was maybe anticipated. I think a lot of us were very scared of what the flea beetle numbers were going to be, and certainly they were tough in some areas. But I mean, are we really putting any canola in the ground without significant seed treatments at this point?
Yeah, seed treatments, period, works. When we're taking a look at flea beetles, and anyone that I talk to where they have little plots and they're going and doing their untreated control check, they have to reseed that usually because nothing pops out of the ground. It's just a big black patch of dirt, just like it could be one of these plots if we had a untreated check and there was, say, a Fusarium infection or a Pythium infection for canola seed, right? Mm-hmm. So, as long as you have even a base treatment, that really does help. But especially in some areas, we saw in Manitoba over a couple of years where there was really high flea beetle pressure. That's kind of the key, where maybe that is going to be one of your must-have traits, or especially in this case, a treatment, where you're actually going to opt for that extra upgraded seed treatment if it's available for what you're choosing. Now, yes, that does come up with a greater of a cost, but potentially that could let your canola plant get out of the ground that much sooner. It's at a very vulnerable stage there, and you could save yourself, 2-3 foliar applications running over your fields to try and save it, as well as the additional stress of actually going and watching these little canola plants pop out of the ground. But as you mentioned, Lindsay, before, cutworms kind of surprised us a little bit because we were so focused on flea beetles. And while probably rightfully so, we do want to be really focused on flea beetles because time and time after again, they're by far our most major pest that is going to reduce our yields drastically. So while that's good that a lot of people are opting for those upgraded seed treatments, it's also not a bad idea to actually consider potentially the history of cutworms in your area. I don't think we have many good predictive models if your cutworms are going to show up again, but maybe a base treatment that has some sort of cutworm control can really help you there.
Mm-hmm. Sheila, you're nodding, and I know that, and Peter and Jason are east and west in the chat, and so sort of the canola soybean in the chat as well. That, I mean, for soybean, we are probably far more concerned about disease than we are are insects. And for canola, it's really the opposite. Yes, there are diseases, but really it's that flea beetle and cutworm control that we're looking for, or at least some tolerance, some protection. Sheila, so when we're thinking about those diseases, same idea. Do you see that base treatment really is a no-brainer at this point?
Yeah, I think so. I think our growers on the heavy clays in Ontario, they would not plant without Phytophthora protection. And the odd time there's some trial seed or something that goes out without treatment on it, and you experience the conditions that you can have, and the growers and the sales agencies are like, wow, that stuff really does work. It's kind of been a no-brainer. Don't think about it, but it's just cheap insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, we're going to jump to, I've got just a short clip with Nate Ort, who was with the Canola Council at the time, talking through some of these decisions on deciding on that variety, and then we'll hear from our show sponsors.
I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that every farmer's priority is unique to them. And I think we're going to go through some priorities today, but just to keep that in mind that, you might prioritize things in front of something else that even your neighbor might prioritize. So just something to keep in mind.
So what are some of these priorities?
Yeah, so one would be herbicide rotation, not only for, the canola crops that you grow, but all of your crops. So keep that in mind. What are you spraying on your wheat acres, your soybean acres if you grow soybean? And take that into account when picking the right hybrid. Harvest management comes into play. Are you going to be straight cutting? So are you looking for a pod shatter tolerant hybrid? Are you going to be swathing? So maybe that selection criteria, you're not looking for a pod shatter tolerant hybrid. Or maybe you're going to swath a pod shatter tolerant hybrid. Lots of farmers do that. So that's an option too. So another thing to keep in mind when choosing the right hybrid for your fields is disease resistance. So, this past fall, we've gone into the fields, we've clipped stems, we know what's out there, and now we can plan ahead for the next growing season, and we can, start tackling these challenges. And then, of course, performance is something to keep in mind. So that includes yield, hybrid history. How has this hybrid performed on your farm in the past if you've grown it before, or how has it performed for neighbors? So that would be, how has this hybrid performed in your environment? So that's super important. And then end use traits. So there's some hybrids out there that can be grown and marketed, and then you can get a premium. So some producers, farmers will prioritize that. And then there's also the yield limiting factors. So disease we touched on, there can be soil limitations, and then growing environment too. Lots of areas in Western Canada don't have as long of a growing season as others. So maturity comes into play there, where you might only be able to select hybrids that mature earlier. And then just two other kind of brief things to keep in mind is seed treatments. Are the seed treatments that come with this hybrid, are they addressing the challenges, that you have on your farm, whether that be insect or disease pressure? And then standability. So, again, how has this hybrid performed in your area before? Has a heavy wind knocked it down? Standability can be a disease issue too. So again, get out there, clip stems, know what's in your field. That's super important.
The Agronomist is brought to you by ADAMA Canada, Acadian Plant Health, and Enlist E3 from Corteva. Looking for high yields and clean fields? Choose Enlist E3 soybeans, part of the Enlist weed control system. Enlist E3 soybeans help you control tough weeds, providing herbicide choice and tank mix flexibility. Enlist E3 soybeans, the best in beans, period. I love that I pulled a clip where he had his poppy on. So it was like the perfect timing, everybody. Didn't even do it on purpose, but I'm going to pretend like I did. Anyway, okay, so a few things from that. And Chris, before we get to, you've got a great sort of flow chart to sort of talk through some of this. But Sheila, he mentioned one thing that certainly applies to soybeans as well, looking at sort of the IP bean side of things. That becomes a herbicide issue. Mostly is my understanding, but is there enough, like, is the premium enough, do you think, to give up some of these or take on some of those challenges in selecting those varieties? Or do you decide ahead of time, I'm going IP, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going conventional, this is what I'm going to do.
I actually just had a good conversation with someone on this topic last night. Going IP or growing IP is something that's a real commitment. You need to be ready for it. You need to be planning. In corn, we have challenges with insect traits. In soybeans, we have challenges with weed control. So you need to have your A game already set up if you're going to go IP. But I've also had conversations with long-term IP growers who felt that they couldn't manage their weeds any longer and they needed to switch systems. So again, one of the key things he had said was that it's individual for each grower. That is for sure. It's different with your neighbor, but if you're going to be IP, you also need to know what your neighbors are doing. So in any herbicide tolerant system, having your own plan and knowing what your neighbors are going to do is really important.
Good fences make good neighbors, but so does good weed control. So there you go. And Jim says the pod shatter trait has gained us a lot of yield in central Ontario. I wish we had shadow resistance matched with our winter canola. I believe it, Jim. Also, I mean, I know that the one variety you have to choose from is really good with winter canola, but you have one variety. So that becomes a completely moot point at this on the winter canola side. For Ontario, it's a pretty easy decision. Are you growing winter canola? Here is Mercedes. Spring canola, hey, that's different, but there you go. Okay, so Chris, Nate sort of went through, that decision tree in some ways. I do like how he sort of put it. Thinking about, and we are going to dig in a little bit more on the herbicide tolerance and on some of our herbicide systems as well a little bit later. But thinking about your weed spectrum, but thinking about other crops in rotation too, and then sort of how we go through this. So Producer Jay, if you can bring up, Chris, do you know which slide it is? Your third one, maybe? The decision flow chart.
It's the
There
third
you
one.
go. Look, Producer Jay's way ahead of me. There we go. Okay. So there you go. Okay, so walk us through this. And how do you use this sort of flow chart?
Yeah, so I mean, right now with canola cultivar selection, of course, it can be pretty overwhelming, but we really want to condense it into, a few different steps here. And really the first step is figure out what are your must-haves, what can your farm not live without? And for some folks, that may be that pod shatter trait, that Nate really touched on, helping that harvest management, letting that canola stand because you probably have other crops that need to get taken off. That's great. But there's a few other questions that you kind of have to ask along with that, and that's really, what's been yielding really well for you over the past few years. Is that the champion for your field and for your farm? That would be great. And then also kind of expanding that past, what cultivars have been performing consistently in your area? So we've seen a variety of growing situations. I keep going back to Manitoba because this is where I travel the most, and we saw some really high drought conditions, really intense heat there. And then also we had some really wet, moist areas as well. So, is there kind of that happy medium for a cultivar that can perform well in all those situations? Now, kind of going back to that kind of must-have features and all that, you kind of have to think about, okay, so if you're going to look for a trait, say clubroot resistance, is there another way that you could be managing that pathogen or that yield robber? For clubroot, it's usually by genetics. And so if you're going to have that issue, you're probably going to want to opt for that. But if we see something like, say, blackleg, where the cultivars you may be interested in don't have like a specific R gene to match the pathogens that you found in your field, then you may want to opt for, say, an upgraded seed treatment that can actually manage that blackleg infection later on. So it's a lot about what you can do on your traits and treatment side, and then also what are the other alternatives, and then also balance that profitability aspect as well, because you may be paying a little bit more for a little bit more of that convenience to tackle those issues earlier on with your seed.
Peter is giving you a high five for calling them cultivars and not varieties. So there you go. You guys can geek out about why that's important. But all right. So Jason has a question here. Chris, we saw seed place fertilizer being a big factor in emergence of canola with the work we did with the canola growers. Where are we at with that? So do we have any updates on is that the recommendations that might need tweaked? Where's that at?
Yeah, well, I think in a lot of areas where we saw a lot of drought, that really shows the issues, right? Moisture hides a lot of, underlying concerns with that. And so when we saw with seed place fertilizer, a lot of growers probably got away with it in a lot of years because they had the moisture for it and that the canola could probably grow out of it and the toxicity wasn't as high. This year, where it was dry, it was hanging around there for a lot longer. And then that's where you really got burnt, both literally and figuratively. So, um, definitely keeping that in mind that maybe we have to tone down our rates a little bit or, do more side row or mid row banding and putting a little bit more weight there. Um, yeah, I'd say moisture and the environmental conditions really had a role to play in what we saw, especially with the trials that Jason was referring to.
Good growing conditions can hide a lot of sins. Let's put it that way. And sometimes we get them, and that's okay. We'll take our wins. All right. So, but that does. So Sheila, in switching gears a little bit, in thinking about traits and treatments, definitely thinking that bigger picture. We've got a clip I'll go to in a little bit, but did want to sort of set this up. So obviously for the West, if you've got canola in rotation, especially in Manitoba, you probably also have soybeans. In the East, we've got some very different crops with our wheat and corn and soy, but we have very, very difficult to control weeds and weeds that get out of hand in different crops. And so how much has the importance of choosing your herbicide tolerant system changed in the past few years here in Ontario?
Well, it is getting more complex, but I think it's for the better. Like I mentioned before, Mother Nature is always a step ahead of us. Weed control in soybeans is the challenge. So we now have the introduction of Enlist E3 soybeans. So there's options, right? Growers can choose an extend system, an IP system. Growers can choose an extend system, and they can now choose an Enlist E3 soybean system. So it's good to have choice. Corteva is going to be 100% Enlist E3 in 2025 for our traded soybean offering, which is a pretty bold move. And I think some customers, some growers are thinking, why would you do that? But we are taking that leadership position because we see the benefits of the system to growers in managing weed control. Managing your weeds is going to give you better yields. We need to manage resistance of weeds, as we're already seeing, but we need to manage risk as well. So we feel the Enlist E3 system can do all of those things, bringing peace of mind, especially if your neighbor is an IP grower and doesn't want your herbicides killing their soybeans,
right?
And then gives the grower some breathing room in the season.
So in looking at specifically Enlist and that Corteva is moving, as you said, strictly into Enlist E3 in a few years, where does it really shine? Where have you really seen the best success in putting this together? What kind of system? Full stop.
So I think, and you're probably going to play a clip in a little bit from a long time ago, but the same things resonate, right? You need to have a residual program and a program approach. So Jay, I think you brought my slide up, the program approach in action. And these were demo plots that we did in Tavistock. And I have to admit, I am a plant breeder by training. I am not a weed control person, but I've learned so much this summer. We did these demos in Tavistock, and on the left you see a one pass approach. So you spray the Enlist chemistry with glyphosate at V3 and you have weeds come through. If you do a two pass with a residual multi-mode of action, it's much cleaner. This is at the Tavistock Corn Research Center, and it's pretty normal weeds there, right? Some ragweed, some lamb's quarters, a bit of annual grass. So even without difficult to control weeds, the first pass approach didn't work. So, you need to use a residual multi-mode of actions. And then if you get into other parts of the province where we have fleabane and water hemp, it becomes even more imperative to think about this sort of an approach.
And everyone in Manitoba, when you say water hemp, tries to plug their ears, but you can't. So we are going to talk a little bit about it. And Sheila did mention that clip. So I think actually now, Producer Jay, if you would, cue it up for me. And then we can play the read after it. But I want to set this up a little bit before Producer Jay plays it for us. So this is a video with Rob Miller with BASF talking about dicamba and talking about the Extend system 6 years ago. And so part of the reason I pulled this is because I really wanted to see, and I want us to talk about sort of what has happened in the last 6 years. You know, are we where we thought we would be? What have we learned in the past 6 years? So Producer Jay, if you would roll that clip.
So I'm standing in a plot of Roundup Ready 2 Extend soybeans, and we're looking at evaluating multiple modes of effective action and weed management in Roundup Ready 2 Extend soybeans, or dicamba tolerant soybeans. So the first plot I'm standing here is just glyphosate alone applied as a burn down. And it was applied about 4 weeks ago, and you can see that there are some weeds that are starting to, the secondary flushes, as you would expect. There's no residual with glyphosate, but it did take out the initial weed flush, and now you're starting to see those weeds come up. If you're a farmer looking at this plot, you know, you're in the critical weed-free period, you probably needed to spray this trial about 10 days ago, say. But as we move over to the next plot, I'm standing in a plot of Ingenia, and this is BASF's new dicamba formulation that will be available on the market for multiple crops, including Roundup Ready 2 Extend soybeans or dicamba tolerant soybeans. You can see that, you know, we do have a little bit better weed control, but the thing to remember about dicamba is that the residual activity can be variable. It depends on soil type, the weather, as well as the amount of rainfall, the amount of breakdown. So we are 4 weeks after application. This is kind of, you know, looks better on a drier year than it does in a wet year because dicamba is very water soluble. So the residual weed control can be variable. In a wetter year, you get less residual because it moves down the soil profile. In a drier year, it actually looks a little bit sharper. So the next plot I'm standing in is Ingenia plus Optil. So Optil combines 2 modes of action, the Kickstart technology, as well as Pursuit for the residual weed control, and then Ingenia is the dicamba formulation. So on these Roundup Ready 2 Extend soybeans, you can see that having multiple modes of effective action, as well as a true residual partner, will keep those beans weed-free during that critical weed-free period. This is great technology, this is new technology, but we want to make sure that we adapt our weed management system so that we don't burn out this new technology and maximize its effectiveness. So having multiple modes of effective action to control some of these resistant biotypes like Candida fleabane, common water hemp, common ragweed, as well as giant ragweed, will maximize your yield potential and also decrease the selection pressure of some of these various weeds.
Tonight's show is brought to you by ADAMA Canada, Enlist E3 from Corteva, and Acadian Plant Health. Build a strong, high-yielding crop from the ground up. Acadian Plant Health biostimulants improve nutrient use efficiency and build crop resiliency against weather stress at each critical stage of development. For 40 years, Acadian Plant Health has developed biostimulant solutions used on over 100 crops in more than 80 countries worldwide. Find out how at acadianplanthealth-na.com. All right, so here we are, 6 years later. We certainly, you know, we've seen what some of these systems can do. Sheila, you know, the idea of that residual product, multiple modes of effective action, this is, I think we're on the same page on that. We're using different ways to get there, but how important is that? What have we seen in the last 6 years since that came out?
Yeah, that clip rings true today, right? That is the exact same message that we are delivering to our customers. The thing that has changed is new herbicide tolerance. So now we have Enlist E3, so you can spray Enlist, which is 2,4-D technology, which offers you some more peace of mind when you're in crop in the summertime. We don't talk a lot about off-target movement, but I think we need to start talking about it more. So that's the peace of mind that Enlist brings. But otherwise, we haven't gotten rid of the problem. And if we don't continue with a residual upfront plus multiple modes of effective action, we, in the next 6 years, will be in a much more difficult position.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chris, the similar things, similar challenges, of course, exist in Western Canada, maybe different weeds and in different systems, but similar challenges as well. I think correct me, it's like 98% of the canola has some sort of herbicide tolerant package. Now, not all of them are GMO, but it's the vast majority of acres go in with some sort of herbicide tolerant system. Are you seeing a lot of shifting between them? Are they still, do growers have their favorites and that's the system they work in, or are you seeing that evolving as well?
I can probably see this kind of field really evolving in terms of herbicide tolerance, because now, in recent years, we're starting to see, the addition of stack traits where we do actually have glyphosate and glufosinate stacked canola. So you actually do have that option to switch between the two. And I think that's really important nowadays because, across the prairies, now everyone's kind of got their, pesky weed. In Manitoba, we're starting to see that water hemp starting to creep up. Other places, we're starting to have that group 9 and 2 resistant kochia. And in some cases, I think it's even 3-way as well. So, being able to have more of those options is excellent. And then, of course, as you mentioned, not all of them are GMO. We do have some group 2 canola that is available. And what the really nice benefit about that is you can actually get that market premium potentially for being non-GMO. But also keep in mind that produces another kind of layer of complexity to your farming system. Does that have a fit in your farm? Maybe. Mm-hmm. But you really have to kind of weigh those pros and cons. How are you going to manage your weeds and other alternatives? Are you going to have some pre-emerge products coming down? Or are you going to go to the group iron tillage? Hopefully not as much. But, there's different kind of approaches to it. And I'd say a lot of these herbicide systems have an opportunity to change things up a little bit.
But then we have volunteers. And then what do we do with the volunteers? You get children to go and pull the plants. I'm just kidding. But Rob, I didn't realize Rob was watching tonight. Rob, that was 6 years ago, and I don't think you've aged a bit. So there you go. So thanks for that, Rob. It is lovely to pull some of these old schools and see that some of them are super relevant. Some of them desperately need updating, but it's great to see Rob joining us. So thanks so much for popping in. All right. So, okay. So this does though, and I have to ask this question, and I think we have to have this discussion. Sheila, I'll start with you. That, the people will say we can't spray ourselves out of a problem that spraying got us into, but there is a definite way that these herbicide tolerant systems, these more advanced systems, really open up options we didn't have before for some of this weed control. So how do you sort of marry those two or think about that challenge to it?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed since the 90s when we came up with Roundup Ready, and we sprayed ourselves into that problem. We waited until the weeds were big, harder to kill, those biotypes that might survive and reproduced, and guess what? They're glyphosate resistant. So that's why, I'm happy to see the entire industry, taking this stand on stewardship, identifying that we are behind Mother Nature, right? Or she's just on our heels. So it's good to see that the industry is going that way. And that we're thinking about the future. By no way, shape, or form are we indicating that you spray one herbicide all the time like it was the late 90s. We're saying multiple herbicides, multiple modes of action, multiple effective modes of action, I think is a good key point to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, there is a question here, and Chris, maybe you can help us out on this on trials. And so this is one, and Sheila, you've shared, the seed guide, and there's often from each company, some of them have an incredible amount of information to wade through. but of course, then we at times have, say, dealers that have demonstration plots. Sometimes we have third-party data, depending on what crop we're dealing with. So, Chris, where are we at with the canola hybrid trials in the West? Because there's been some significant changes there.
Yeah, so I believe we do have the canola performance trials, which were those third-party trials I think they're referring to. They are continuing right now, but there is a lot of, chatter amongst, say, the provincial grower groups, if there's an interest into that. And if people really want to see, say, third-party trials of that to actually have comparisons intercompany style, I guess, it could be worthwhile to see. But don't forget that a lot of company trials, they are very well done. And I would say definitely take a look at them in there to gain that extra bit of information for that. That being said, the Canola Performance Trials website is still online. So all the cultivars that were there, I think maybe the last growing season was either 21 or 22, you can still refer to. And also, there's a lot of other third-party agronomy retail groups that still run their own trials. And they have some really interesting data now, especially with satellite imagery, a lot of this digital ag technology to make different kinds of comparisons other than just yield. So there's different things you can take a look at still, even if the canola performance trials aren't going to be around.
Mm-hmm. Sheila, what all goes into what we see on that screen when you have that guide? What goes on behind the scenes to put something like that together, as far as the data is concerned?
Wow, so much. We have breeding efforts in Eastern Canada, in Western Canada. So we have a really nice footprint of product development from the earliest stages after the first cross all the way to the year before commercialization that the research organization manages. And then once we commercialize a product, it goes out to the sales agencies to an even bigger network of trials. So, and what I always say, we don't need that many plots to figure out if something's going to yield well. We use all of those opportunities to get opportunity traits. So I'll use white mold as an example. I know Peter mentioned it. Southwestern Ontario, had white mold that most people haven't seen in a really long time. So we used that opportunity to take in-field observations, couple it with the genetic information that we have to come up with the scores that we publish. And that's just one trait. We're doing it on everything else, using remote sensing and using all of our boots on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Chris, that makes me think of verticillium. Frozen. I'm going to keep talking now. Auctions about, do we have some tolerance in our existing cultivars, to use Peter's word and Chris's word? Do we have the same sort of, is that the companies are going back and looking through that? I mean, I know you don't work for them, but if you can share sort of how companies are dealing with something like a new, I'll use air quotes, a new disease threatening canola, are they headed back and trying to evaluate what might be in the germplasm already?
Yeah, the really difficult thing about, say, verticillium is that we can see it presented with blackleg as well. And trying to tease out, what are the differences in performance of all these cultivars on either these small plot trials or large scale trials can be difficult to figure out. In Manitoba, I would say it's a lot of places got affected by that. But that being said, you still can tease out some differences. And, depending on, the germplasm that it's coming from, there may be some level of differential resistance. And some research that was conducted from our last canola agroscience cluster did support that there is actually, a measurable degree of resistance in some of the cultivars, potentially experimental germplasm that was evaluated, especially compared to Westar, which just looked horrible. So that's really promising.
I haven't heard Westar in a long time, Chris. Anyone actually mention it? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. But what's really nice to see too now is that, now that we've really identified verticillium stripe to actually be, a problem child for canola now, we really want to see more breeding efforts being done and maybe more active selection towards genetic resistance for this. Knowing that we have less cultural controls and other methods to deal with it right now, genetic resistance is probably going to be one of our chief ways to get out of it, just like we've seen with, say, clubroot.
Jason's got a question here. I love this question. Anytime we can talk about hairy canola, I am happy. Sheila, please don't die on air. That would be terrible. Okay. Take a breath. Yeah. Okay. So, where are we at with hairy canola managing flea beetles? And so, for anyone who doesn't know what hairy canola is, it literally is what it sounds like. It is a little plant with lots of little hairs on it. Yeah. Where are we at?
Yeah, so I had a good chat, maybe a half a year or so or more ago with Dwayne Hegedus from AFC in Saskatoon, where he's been working on this hairy canola for a little while. And they've actually made a lot of progress over, the past 5-10 years on getting this eventually to a form where we can maybe see in the market. Now, the tricky thing is that the genetics that controls what we see on the cotyledons is different than what we see on the true leaves as well as on the stems. So while we can't really see the high density hairs on the cotyledons where we really want to have it there, we see really good protection on the true leaves, which is great. Now, I can't say for sure if we're going to see this to market or if there's going to be a timeline for that, but I do know that there's still going to be research going on, because that would be our golden goose. If we can get a non-chemical solution towards flea beetles, that would be awesome. But there's a lot of other kind of things that are kind of promising down the line that may, move us away from seed treatments or foliar insecticides as well. So stay tuned.
Is it like AI? Is it just going to be like a little machine that goes and like dusts each one of them off? Anyway, I don't know. I'll come up with something. Usually each episode we come up with some sort of outlandish idea. And when I say we, I mean me. Okay, so we're running out of time here, but we've covered quite a bit, which is great. But there's a few things certainly want to fit in here. So Sheila, definitely from your perspective in putting together all of these things, yes, early in the season, what is sort of that process for you in trying to match up seed treatment, package, genetics, yield potential, and of course what's happening in the backyard, because everything has to apply to your farm. So what is that process?
That process, I think, just is really good record keeping. Agriculture is an emotional business, right? It's hard to not think about that one spot in the field where you didn't have success. But take a holistic approach, keep good records. There's all sorts of systems to help you maintain photos, maintain information about what went on. And I think if you have good records, then you can move forward and make a decision more clearly without that emotional side of things. But like I said, it's complex. Ask for help. We have great teams of agronomists across the country that can help you on these new technologies. And the switch to all E3 by 2025, that's going to be a big challenge for some growers who fell in love with varieties and maybe don't want to switch. But that's where, coming from a plant breeding side of things, the genetic backbone, if you believe in that, your all systems go.
It's a really good point in thinking about, as you mentioned, the white mold this year, and Peter, I think, mentioned it in the chat earlier, Eastern Ontario, we are a pretty white mold heavy region, but maybe not as bad for gibberella in general. And then the Southwest is maybe the South is the flip of that. And so what can you learn maybe from, so something like this year, exactly that, those tough areas, you're right, that sometimes can really drag us down when you're driving through them and it's just awful. Sometimes it can be hard not to focus on that. But how do you learn from, or what can you take from some of those issues that hit us really hard, like a year like this one?
That it's hard to predict the future, but and Peter has a comment in there about how do you know what's a 3 from one company versus what's a 6 from another. And I hope as growers are seeing and hearing about issues, go visit your local sales reps plots, right? That's the seed guide in living form. And so that can help you out. Okay, well, that product is a 3 for white mold. What does it look like versus a product that's a 6? And then that'll give you some idea of where to go without reading the tiny footprints in the seed guide, which I recommend at any time. They're really informative.
Read the fine print, everybody.
Yeah.
But you're a plant breeder, so you want to know all the minutia. Not everybody does. But but I mean, so Chris, further to that point, in going through and poring over, and this is a good segue to what will be our next episode on November 20th, is looking at some of that data, trying to compare. How do you suggest that growers, agronomists work together to sort of try and compare apples to apples, because it can be a challenge at times?
Yeah, and it even becomes more difficult because even in some areas where you have the thunderstorm water, your plots can be different even across a whole field for the strips. So replication, I would say, is definitely going to be key. Have exact same comparables inside that field. You really want to take a look at those local trials. That will be really, really helpful for that. And then also the aggregate data as well. Statistics is very, very powerful in terms of determining that. But don't forget that the average top yielding cultivar out there may not be the best one for you, because it may be a very late season canola variety for you that you just can't grow in your area. So sometimes we have to temper our expectations for that, and build a little bit more of a story for ourselves by taking a look at, say, those must-have traits and such. But and to compare apples to apples, there is a lot of independent data. Talk to your seed retailers, ask, how are these trials conducted? Be your own little scientist to actually kind of tease out what's actually going on there. And you may be surprised on what may actually be the best fit for you.
And how important is it to try a new variety in a year? So Sheila, I think you're bang on as far as the emotional part of this, right? Everybody has their favorite. I think maybe it happens in something like wheat, maybe more, that doesn't turn over quite as quickly. Peter, don't throw things at me. But Chris, how do you get people to try something new, to give it a shot on, say, 80 acres, nothing major for the West, sorry. But yeah.
Yeah. It's an excellent idea to try at least more than one variety on your field. We see a lot of horror stories where, one person's growing one cultivar on 5,000 acres. Even if you're going on a little small strip inside one of those fields, it's another data point for your own fields. And if you keep on doing that consecutively over many years, all of a sudden, again, you're building that story towards what actually can work for you. Now that doesn't mean you should be running your own trials and running 6 different varieties on your field, because logistically that can be difficult, but at least have 2, or, you probably have your clear winner that you want to go to because it has that guaranteed profitability, but definitely try something new, even if it costs a little bit more, because you may get that ROI back.
Sheila, as a plant breeder, do you insist that everyone try something new every year?
I would, if it was my farm. We have a little thing called genetic gain in the business, and it's real. And so it's really exciting to see something new. And as Chris said, don't always be chasing the yield. Sometimes we're a little addicted to yield from the graphs and the charts, but you got to make sure. I love that your non-negotiables, what are those for you? And take a look at something that might be different.
Take some of the emotion out of it, right? It's still going to be emotional as far as you feel strongly one way, or you're perhaps, farming is risky. So to have that tried and true in your back pocket. But I think, that exercise of figuring out, what is perhaps a growing concern on your farm. So maybe it is that weed spectrum. Maybe it is those tough to kill weeds. Maybe it is white mold as weather patterns change. What might be those top ones, those non-negotiables, I think is great advice. So I think we will leave it there. Peter, I love your comment about the fine print. Sheila is writing the fine print. So of course you should be reading the fine print. I love that. All right. So Sheila, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Really appreciate it. our last question of the night, what one thing are you looking to learn more of this winter at all our conferences?
I am really pumped about the data talk that you guys are going to have next.
All right. Yes,
Yeah.
I am too.
Yeah.
I'm super excited about that one. And Chris, the conference season starts, I think, in 3 weeks for you, and then it'll be 4 months of meetings. What do you look forward to learning about this winter?
Yeah, I'm going to be really interested in what's happening, across Canada in terms of the response to all these interesting weather events that we've been having. What is the performance of all these crops in these really stressful conditions? And can we see some clear winners that actually perform well underneath them? I am really curious and ready to ask around.
All right. Very cool. Okay. Chris, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
No, thank you very much, Lindsay.
And Sheila, thank you as well.
Thank you, and safe harvest to everyone that's out there with feels like less daylight every day. So
a lot less.
Safe harvest.
Yeah, I will say around here, just west of Ottawa, a lot of corn came off this weekend as we had just a break in the weather and the sun was shining, albeit not for very long, but a lot got done. So yes, absolutely stay safe out there. And of course, so just a quick reminder for next week, there is no show, but we will be back November 20th to talk about data collection, to talk about good data, how to make our best decisions from it. So don't miss that. That's November 20th, 8 p.m. Eastern. Again, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow and let us know you took in the show, and we'll get you those CEU credits. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Stay safe, everybody. Cheers.